Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for joining me tonight. So this is the third session of four. The series is called Artists of Possibility, Exploring the Varieties of Visionary Genius. And what I've done is chosen four different people, all of whom happen to be heroes of mine, heroes or heroines, and I'm offering these hour-long sessions to share with you some of my love for what these people represent to me and have represented to me and who they are. And I hope that what I'm able to convey to you inspires you in your own journey of self-discovery and creativity, to find your own artistry of possibility, to find whatever it is that you uniquely have to bring to the world in the way that the people we're going to speak about found something that they could uniquely bring to the world. So today we will be exploring Anais Nin. That's how I have learned that the pronunciation of her name is Anais Nin, which I was told was more of a French pronunciation. In English, she's often known as Anais Nin. And, oh yes, I have my shirt. So it's a bit of a dark shirt, but I think you can get a sense. She's an incredibly striking woman. Her parents were Cuban. She was born in France, but she moved at the age of 11 to America. Then she moved back to France for a time and lived in Paris, most famously, and eventually moved back to America and lived the rest of her life here in the United States. She's a well-known figure. She's had a hot and cold relationship with the various waves of feminism. There have been periods of time in which she was held as a true pioneer and progenitor, and other times where she was seen as a sellout. And one of the interesting things about Anais Nin is that her diaries, which was her most famous writing, were published in stages. And so the initial diaries had enormous amounts of things edited out of them, and then after her death were released the rest of the diaries, the parts that had been edited out. And so people got a different view of her depending on which diaries were being released. So in this series, we started by speaking about Fernando Pessoa. Fernando Pessoa was a Portuguese poet, similar time period to Anais Nin, but it's funny, but Fernando Pessoa didn't live as long, so he died earlier. He also was born a bit sooner, but their lives would have overlapped. As far as I know, they didn't know anything of each other. Fernando Pessoa would have died before Anais Nin became well known, so it would have been easy for him to miss her. And Fernando Pessoa didn't become well known until long after he died and long after she died. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if she had never heard of him. But in some ways they were very similar. They had a similar commitment to dreaming, a similar commitment to the imagination. They were equally feverishly dedicated writers. Fernando Pessoa wrote constantly his whole life. Anais Nin wrote constantly for her whole life. So in some ways they were very similar, in some ways they were very different. Fernando Pessoa, had a very ordinary job, worked every day, wrote every day, didn't seem to live anything like an exciting life, except in his mind. He always said that his dreams and his inner world was where all the excitement of his life took place. Anais Nin, on the other hand, lived an unbelievably exciting life, which we'll talk about. It was all part of her artistry of possibility. One of the things about an artist of possibility is it's not just their products, it's not just their creative works that are that become a demonstration of possibility. It's their whole life in certain ways. And everyone that we spoke about, so Fernando Pessoa first, last week we spoke about Charles Sanders Peirce, the American philosopher, this week Anais Nin, next week Gertrude Stein. These are all people who completely dedicated their life to something. And they did it tirelessly, they did it consistently, and for the most part, Fernando Pessoa, during his lifetime, never achieved fame. He became famous long after he died. Same with Charles Sanders Peirce. Although Peirce was respected among some of his peers, he didn't achieve anything like fame, hasn't really still achieved anything like fame outside of academic circles, but wasn't known at all until sometime after his death. Anais Nin was virtually unknown until the end of her life. And then in the end of her life, essentially the last decade, she was incredibly well known. Gertrude Stein, who we will talk about next week, was better known during her lifetime, not initially, but she became better known, and we'll go into that next week. So the interesting question with each of these people is, what is it exactly that they were exploring? Like, what was the possibility that they were consumed by? And with Pessoa, we spoke about identity. He wrote under over 72 heteronyms, which he felt like were just other personalities that would write through his body. And those personalities had different styles and different feelings. And he was exploring how shifting one's identity could radically shift one's writing. Peirce was consumed by a quest to know the workings of the universe, to understand how evolution takes place, and to be able to do it in a way that wasn't limited by the human perspective. He wanted to be able to find the biggest possible view, and we spoke a lot about him last week. And what we will speak about today with Anais Nin, she was consumed by the idea of self-actualization, self-liberation, freedom, and in her writing and in her way of writing, and also in her life. So one thing I want to share right off the bat about Anais Nin, I started my relationship with her in my 20s. I had some of her fiction and some of her diaries. And I was, like Fernando Pessoa, both of them, I was intrigued by them from a very early age. And they were always kind of with me in some way, although they were a bit peripheral to my vision. Charles Peirce, on the other hand, I discovered him much later. I only discovered him about 12 years ago, but I got immediately consumed by reading everything I could about and by him. So with Anais Nin, I feel like I'm sharing to you from the very center and middle of my relationship to her. I feel like over the last 3 years, I've had a growing awakening in the direction that she was exploring. And over the past year, as I've been reading both Fernando Pessoa and her, and in some ways there's a resonance between them for me, that awakening has continued. And I guess the way that I would want to characterize that is it's an awakening to the power and the richness of very intimate personal experience. The most intimate experience, the most spontaneously emerging emotional response to what is, and what one can learn about oneself by examining that very spontaneous, unmitigated, unfiltered initial response, which I think was a huge part of what Nin was exploring as a writer and also in her personal life. The other thing I love about Anais Nin is her almost ferocious commitment to being unconventional. And of course, as a woman in the 20s and 30s, when she was in Paris, her commitment to being unconventional is even more astounding. Which is why she was so enormously embraced initially by the feminist movement when her initial diaries came out, because people were reading these and thinking, oh my God, this was just an untethered human being. And you know, one thing about artists of possibility, at least as I see it, these are not saints. They are expressions of life deeply and fully and exhaustively lived in very different directions. But they're not saints. They aren't necessarily good people in every respect, and they have their flaws. And it does seem like people with that degree of creativity surging through them often have shortcomings. And it's true of Fernando Pessoa. It was maybe even more dramatically true of Peirce, and in many ways true of Nin and also Gertrude Stein. But maybe just to say a little bit about Nin's life. As I said already, her parents were Cuban. She was born in Paris. Her father left the family when she was 11 for a younger woman. And so Nin moved with her mom to New York. So at age 11, on a ship to New York, was when she started writing her diaries, which were, initially, they were letters to her father, essentially saying how great New York was, and in the hopes that somehow she would convince him to come to rejoin them in New York. The letters never got mailed, but that initiated her diary writing practice, which she maintained until her death at 73 years old. So from age 11 to age 73, she kept more than, I think more than one diary at a time, it seems, and wrote in her diaries, from what I've gathered, almost every day. So just an enormous commitment to writing and to expressing. And in that sense, I really see the parallel to Fernando Pessoa, who also wrote every day, all the time. Not diaries, and not always as the same person, but he wrote. They both had the fever for that kind of expression. Now, Nin got married to a man named Hugh, who was a banker. And his job took him to Paris, which is why they went back to Paris. Trying to think of which order I want to share the story, and I sometimes jump too far to the end. So they were in Paris together. I'm going to go with this part because it's the famous part. And it was in Paris that Nin met Henry Miller and June. Henry Miller was a young, brash, wanna be a writer at the time. Anais was a bit older. She'd already been published. She wasn't exactly successful, but she was certainly the more established of the two. Their relationship initially was very much around writing. They just deeply appreciated each other's writing, and initially Anais had a crush on and fell in love with Henry's wife June, and writes beautifully in her diary about June and how alluring June was, and how she could hardly be in the same room with June without experiencing overwhelming sensation. But then Henry and her relationship became an affair. It became a love affair that she wrote about in her diaries. He later published a book of love letters between them. And it was Anais Nin and her husband who initially funded the publication of Henry Miller's book, Tropic of Cancer. And Tropic of Cancer was published in, I think, 1932. Was to great acclaim. It was published in Paris. It made him a well-known literary figure. So he became much better known much more quickly. But the book was so full of explicit sexual description that it was banned in America. It wasn't published in America for 30 years. In fact, it got published in the 60s. So Henry Miller was well known in Europe mainly, but not in America. But their relationship is a fascinating one because there was something about their passionate connection, both sexually and as artists, that really fueled both of them in an incredible way, and I think fueled their writing tremendously. So there was a whole period. So the first diary that was published of Anais Nin was the one that covered those years when she met June and Henry, because that was all getting published in the 60s. This is when her diaries finally got published. You know, they were written in the 20s and all her life. The first one finally got published in the 60s sometime. And by then, Henry Miller was a really well-known name in America. And so they said, okay, we want to start with the one that's got Henry Miller in it, because that's the one that'll sell. I understand that. And so that was the first one that came out. Now, when that got published, the thing with Anais was she was living this wild, unconventional life. So everything was a little tricky with her. Nothing was simple. So she wanted to publish this diary, and she needed to include all the stuff about Henry Miller, including the affair, because that's what the publisher wanted, was what was going to be the most exciting part of the book. Part of the problem was Henry had already divorced June, and June had already found out about the affair, but then had a nervous breakdown around it. So Anais needed to get permission from her lawyers to put that in the book, and she was able to finesse that somehow. But even more tricky was that her husband Hugh, who lived in New York, didn't know that Anais was also married to a guy named Robert in Los Angeles. So for a long time, Anais had two husbands. And somehow she managed to keep each husband secret to the other. And so she would make these excuses that she needed to go for months at a time for, on a quest for self or for some kind of a work project. And then she would live in Los Angeles with Robert for a while. And then she would make some excuse to him about why she needed to go back to New York for the publisher. Then she would go back there for a while. But the problem was, if she published that diary and Hugh was in it because they were married at the time, she knew Robert would wonder about this Hugh that she'd never talked about. Like, why did you ever tell me about your first husband? And she didn't want to have to say, well, that's because he's also my current husband. So she had this whole conversation with Hugh about why she thought it would be better if he was just not in the book, and she wanted to protect him, and and so he said, okay, that was fine. By then he already knew about Henry, so that was going to be so he thought that she was protecting him from the embarrassment around her affair with Henry Miller. Little did he know that there was another thing that she was hiding. But that one got published, and the publishers were not sure how it would do, but it just was a sensation, an absolute sensation. Now, she had left all the sex out of everything in these initial books. All of this sexual stuff was not part of the initial books. Later, so she was immediately embraced by the feminist movement as an amazing pioneer of feminism. But later, when the unedited version of the story was published, what the feminist world found out that they didn't like at all was that all this time, while she was living this wild life with Henry and writing, she was being totally supported by her husband, the banker, which just so went against the feminist ideal of not being supported, that she was sort of dropped as a feminist icon. She was subsequently later and more recently picked up again. So you could see she just was wildly unconventional. And there's things about her life that for most of us are a little bit hard to hold. Having two husbands at the same time on opposite coasts and flying back and forth is a little challenging. It goes right along with we're not necessarily talking about a saint. But even more challenging than that is that she actually had a very brief love affair with her own father, which she did for all kinds of psychological reasons. She was seeing a psychoanalyst, who had studied with Freud. She saw for many, many years. And she was on a deep journey of the unconscious, and she was uncovering all the wounding from her father, who had left her early on and had left her with all these negative messages. And eventually they met after many decades. Had a brief affair which Nin said liberated her from the wounding of her father. I have no idea where to put that one, So I put it in my, oh my God, this was a very unconventional person box, and don't really know how to hold it. But I pulled out two quotes that I wanted to read to you that come from some of her journals that I think they help us understand where she's coming from. So she writes, "I don't really want to become normal, average, standard. I want merely to gain in strength, in the courage to live out my life more fully, enjoy more, experience more. I want to develop even more original and even more unconventional traits." So she clearly has a huge commitment to unconventionality. In another quote, she says even more strongly, to hell with balance. I break glasses. I want to burn. Even if I break myself, I want to live only for ecstasy. I'm neurotic, perverted, destructive, fiery, dangerous, lava, inflammable, unrestrained. And there is something that I find incredibly courageous about her willingness and desire to be utterly unconventional. And I know one of the things I have always loved about Anais Nin is that she challenges the conventional in everyone. So I think of myself as pretty unconventional. I have lived a pretty unconventional life, left my original career and wife to join a spiritual community and lived there for 20 years and then watched that fall apart. It's fairly unconventional. And yet I feel like Nin challenges me to recognize that I might be more conventional than I think. And I absolutely adore that about her. Not that I necessarily want to be unconventional in the ways that she chose to be unconventional. It's not that I condone those particular behaviors. But I love the fact that any time I start to read her, I feel her shaking me up somewhere deep inside. Like she's rattling my cage every single time. And I think I can see why people found her irresistible at the time that she was alive, because she was just so utterly wild and free and untamed. You couldn't tie her down. And she wanted to take that freedom, that spontaneity, that unconventionality, and she wanted to express it in her writing. That was, and she and Henry Miller were very similar in that way. There was a lot of similarities about their writing, and the writing is very raw. It's very raw, it's very immediate, very stream of consciousness. Both of them felt like literary structures and literary ideals, just throw them out the window and write something that's passionate, that moves you. So in the 40s, Nin wrote 2 articles on writing, which I found very helpful in understanding her writing. And I pulled out just a few things to share with you. One was called Realism and Reality. And it's essentially about immediacy and emotion and the expression of the unconscious mind. She felt that all of those were, she was feeling like this was the new writing. She felt like the old forms of writing, the old ideas of plot and character, etc., they weren't going to work anymore, because we had discovered the unconscious now. We now knew that we were a lot more than just what we thought we were. And that writing was going to need to find forms that could express more than what we knew about. That was going to be able to somehow express the unconscious itself. Now, this was the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. That's kind of the span over which she's working. And this was a big theme. This was a big part of the impetus for all modern art. Now, this week we're talking about Anais Nin and her writing, a little bit about Henry Miller. Next week, when we speak about Gertrude Stein, one of the great things about speaking about Gertrude Stein is that she influenced just about everybody in a certain era. So then we get, you could talk about her, but inevitably you can't not talk about a whole host of other people. You can't not talk about James Joyce if you're going to talk about Gertrude Stein, and you can't not talk about Ernest Hemingway, and you can't not talk about Sylvia Beach. There's just people you can't not talk about because this was her intimate circle. Later, in New York in the 40s and 50s, the whole idea of spontaneity, again, would become one of the central galvanizing points of a lot of artists. One of the more famous of which was Jackson Pollock. And the whole idea with Pollock's painting, where he would splash paint on canvases, was to get into a state that was so open that the splashing would be guided by unconscious forces. And so that the painting would become a mosaic of the unconscious. Gertrude Stein also very famously was very close to Picasso and many other painters, Matisse. And that, the birth of modern painting was all about breaking through the structures. Because the idea was, if you're structured, if you're trying to recreate forms, known forms, then you're boxing out the unconscious. That you need to go beyond form, beyond structure, beyond anything you know, so that things can come through you that are coming from someplace deeper. And Nin was working in that same domain. So I love this quote. She says, "I intend the greater part of my writing to be received directly through the senses, as one receives painting and art." So she really, her writing was not discursive. She says she wrote poetry in the form of prose. And if you read her fiction or her diaries, or if you read Henry Miller, it's more like poetry in the form of prose. It doesn't have the kind of coherence you're used to. It's beautiful. Fernando Pessoa is very similar. It can be, you have to read for a while before you can learn how to read it. You have to learn how to read at the pace at which it was written, because the way that we've been taught to read, it doesn't totally work for that kind of writing. Next week we'll speak about Stein and James Joyce, and they were plumbing the same depths. My books take place in the unconscious. They differ from poetry by the fact that they contain both the symbol and the interpretation of the symbol. So she thought that in poetry, the poet is trying to put the symbols of the unconscious in the verse, but because she's working in prose, she's both using the symbols and the interpretation of the symbols at the same time. And she says in other places in these writings that there isn't anything in her novels that doesn't have a purpose, that didn't come from somewhere, that wasn't a symbol from the unconscious put on the page, and put exactly that element at exactly that place for reasons she didn't even understand. But the idea was she was just open to that being shared. And she wrote a lot about the expression of living moments. And I feel like she was onto something very beautiful with that. She said that the new novel, the novel that's not going to be about plot and character and rising action and climax and all that, all of the structures of the old novel, the new novel, because it wanted to be open to the full breadth of our being, needs to capture the living moment, she said, which she defined as the immediate emotional reaction to experience. So that's what I was saying earlier. This is where I feel like there's an awakening that she, besides her challenge of my conventionality, there's also this incredible invitation to allow your attention to come to rest on that immediate emotional reaction to experience. The immediate, unmitigated, undefined, not yet shaped, right? This is all part of the coming from the unconscious. What is that first reactive response to experience? Because in that, she says, is where you find your true self, in the spontaneous. It's the one before your ideas about yourself start to shape the response so that it resembles who you think you are. You want to find that very first one, the one that comes unmitigated, the one that's wild and free, that will tell you more about who you truly are. She says, it is in the moments of emotional crisis that human beings reveal themselves more accurately. The heightened moments are the moments of revelation. It is the moment when the real self rises to the surface, shatters its false roles, erupts and assumes reality and identity. The fiery moments of passionate experience are the moments of wholeness and totality of the personality. So these moments where you are just propelled out of yourself, where you're not controlling yourself anymore, where you really are spontaneous, are the ones that reveal who you really are. This is Nin's assertion. And you could see she lived her life that way. She was constantly propelling herself into situations that were, what does she call them? Heightened moments of fiery, passionate response. And then I also said that self-actualization, being your fullest expression of yourself, was her driving force. She says, if you limit yourself only to what seems possible and reasonable, you disconnect yourself from what you truly want. And all that is left is compromise. And I think this goes along with her unconventionality. She had a belief that you should follow exactly what you truly want. It's life. True life can only be lived if you're pursuing your true passion. Everything else is compromise. Everything else is less than what you are capable of and what you're here for. Now, of course, the presumption there is that you know what you really want. And what she's saying is the way you know what you really want is that you have to allow yourself to be unlimited by what seems reasonable. How often are we limited by ideas about, well, that's not really possible, I can't really do that, right? And that's the whole negotiation of compromise. No, that's X, Y, Z, I can't do that. ABC, I can't do that. And we limit what we actually want. She goes on to say, whenever you do something that is not aligned with the yearning of your soul, you create suffering. So for her, she had this unconventional commitment to align with the yearning of her soul. And she lived a life, as I said, I can't condone everything she did in her life, but I find that spirit so inspiring. The willingness to not be limited by what seems reasonable, to not be limited by what's conventional, to find your own true heart and live it completely. And I think what I'll do is I'll come to an end in case there's any thoughts or questions that want to be shared. But I didn't want to give you the impression that she wasn't also a deeply spiritual woman, deeply in pursuit of awakening. And she had her own ideas about awakening. I don't think I have the quote here, but she has a very beautiful quote. I mean, another thing about Anais Nin is she's about the most quotable writer I know. She has some of the most amazingly concise, beautiful, poignant quotes. But she has one that says, essentially, if you follow far enough into the personal, you will always end up at the universal. So her belief was that if you allow yourself to go to that edge where that immediate reaction to experience was occurring and you dove into it deeply, you would come out the other side into something that was actually utterly universal. So she felt that the deep exploration of subjectivity would lead to the universal, to universal truth. And she had some of her ideas about awakening, which I align with myself in many ways. She says there are only two, well, this is a little bit of a different point, but I love this one too, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to go for it. There are only two kinds of freedom in the world, she says. The freedom of the rich and powerful, and the freedom of the artist and the monk who renounce possessions. And I love the fact that she puts artists and monks together. That in and of itself would make me absolutely in love with her. But the fact that she recognizes the similarity between the artist and the monk, that both have renounced the world. The artist and the monk have let go of the worldly concerns and are living a different kind of life altogether. Now, in terms of awakening, she says, there are very few human beings who receive the truth complete and staggering by instant illumination. Most of them acquire it fragment by fragment on a small scale, by successive developments, cellularly, like a laborious mosaic. And she goes on, life is a process of becoming, a combination of states we have to go through. Where people fail is that they wish to elect one state and remain in it. This is a kind of death. So she had this commitment to an ever-expanding awakening, always available to step into something new, always available for what was next, always available for a new experience. And as I have read more about her life and read her, her diaries, you can see, for all of her faults, her great openness to possibility is just astounding. Just her willingness to always take the next step. She never hesitated. She even used to, when she would feel herself having sort of evolved to a new place, she would want to get rid of all of her things and get all new things. Because she said holding on to physical things after you have transcended your old self holds the old self in place. So she'd want to get rid of everything and start all over again as the new self. And she would just do it continually over and over again. Maybe the very last point is she shared the most intimate details of her life and including all the ones I've told you about. Can you even imagine what it would be like to publish books that had those kind of details? And one of the things I was reading about her recently was how, in many ways, she was setting the stage for the kind of internet world we live in now, where so much of everyone's personal life is constantly being shared. And she was doing it 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago. And yeah, I think as a woman who is courageous, radically unconventional, forever willing to expand and jump into her next iteration, she definitely gets my high vote as an artist of possibility, and just a truly extraordinary woman. So I want to thank all of you for all of your attention. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to take some, or just comments, shares, anything anyone wants to say. Margaret says, what was in the book if all the sex was left out? And the relationship was still there, just the sexual descriptions were removed from the first books. Hats to Ariella and Ross. That's nice. And Sarah has raised her hand, so I'm going to open that. Sarah, I think, unmuted you. I don't know. Sophie, can you unmute Sarah? I can't. Sarah, you're unmuted now.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by her, but it's kind of overwhelming thinking about what I could read that would, help me have a more intimate look at her on my own. Is there something in particular that you would recommend?
I just recently read, it's a fairly recent book. It's a biography. It's really good. I would definitely recommend it. It's called The Spy in the House of Anais Nin. She wrote a novel called A Spy in the House of Love, and obviously it's a play on that title. It was written by a woman who's a screenwriter. She wrote the movies Before Sunset and Before Sunrise. That Ethan Hawke was in them, and they're great films. Anyways, she obviously was way more obsessed with Anais Nin than I, and spent a lot of time not only reading her published materials, but all of her unpublished letters and the things that she got both from her home and from UCLA Library, where they keep all Anais's private things. So it's a great book. It's not that long. It's got long quotations of hers, so it's a fantastic way to get to know her better.
What about that book that she wrote you referenced before this?
Which one?
The book that she wrote, that this is a sort of a takeoff on it.
Oh, I have never read it.
Oh.
The Spy in the House of Anais Nin. A Spy in the House of Love. I have not read, so okay. I couldn't recommend it.
Okay, thank you.
And Angela shared this quote of hers, which is a great quote. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. That's in the other incredibly famous quote of hers is, there came a time when remaining tight in the bud was more painful than blossoming, and which is just a brilliant quote. Yes, Margaret is confirming that. Someone is talking about Nin's being supported, needing to be independently wealthy or dependent on the cloister. You know, it's very interesting. The one thing that really she struggled with her whole life was her inability to support herself. Now, she had her husband who was relatively able to support her. And most of her friends, it seems, throughout her life. But she really struggled with the not being able to support herself. Now, of course, at the end of her life, she was a successful writer and she could support herself until her death. But you know, it's and you'll get this if you read that book, the Spy in the House of Anais Nin. You have to take into consideration it's 1920. Why was Henry Miller recognized and she wasn't? So she was battling a feminist campaign. She was finding it. She struggled for decades, being unable to be published, unable to have her work recognized. Hard to know how that was influenced by the fact that she was a woman. She's also well known for being the first woman to write erotic fiction. She has 2 books, I believe, of erotic short stories. They didn't get published till quite later in her life, but she was writing erotic fiction long before that was an acceptable thing for women to be writing about. So she definitely struggled with her inability to support herself for her whole life. But I don't think she was condoning that you should not do that. She was trying to and certainly held that as an aspiration and eventually succeeded. It just took a long, long time. She reminds someone of an Oscar Wilde quote, "To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people exist. That is all." Oh yeah, that's a beautiful quote too. She definitely seems to have truly lived unapologetically. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. So again, thank you all very much. Did her husband ever find out about the other? I think they did. I know Robert did. Robert's the one on the West Coast because he outlived her. I'm not sure about Hugh. I imagine he did, but I'm not sure. He died a bit earlier. But Robert definitely did because the woman who writes that book, A Spy in the House of Anais Nin, when she was a younger woman, she actually visited Robert while he was still alive. That's how she got access to the private letters and diaries that were just in his house at the time, which she includes some discussion about in that book. So I think they did find out. I definitely know Robert found out. And I think they just sort of both, I don't know what they did. What do? I mean, you just throw your hands up and go, okay, whatever. I don't know what to do with that. 10 years, can you imagine? 10 years? It's not like it was a couple of months. 10 years she was flying back and forth and making up excuses. And they were buying it every time. Who knows? You gotta just put that in your bin for who knows how that worked out. I think she was. Someone asked, was she aware of the fact that of what she was doing? She definitely thought she was revolutionizing writing and was leading a revolution in consciousness. So she was definitely aware. I think of what she was doing, at least somewhat, as aware as you can be when you're that unconventional. So perfect, it's 9 o'clock. This was absolutely lovely and so fun to share something with you that's like so immediately burning in my soul right now. And I'm looking forward to continuing my journey with Nin and her thinking. So thank you all very much. Bye now.